So I'm greatly honored to deliver this year's annual lecture, and I feel unworthy in front of all these distinguished scholars, but we have an expression in the Middle East which says, don't be humble, you're not that great. Because, so I won't feign humility, but I will say that before coming here, to me, Siri was an imaginary figure in cyberspace that answered all my questions. Now I realize that person exists. And she's a superhuman, much better even than the cyberspace person. And really, Siri, you have been incredible. In the 24 hours that I've actually seen you, I understand why you have this loyal following and just how special this spirit is in the Bergen exchanges. And I speak about this because we live in times of, I would say, unprecedented despair. There is a sense of despair about the not so pleasant developments that we see around us. And there is a link in the conversations I had with all of you walking 10 kilometers in the mountains yesterday with my Prada shoes, I have to say that. And I was telling the distinguished dean of the law faculty that she'll be getting a bill for my new shoes in due course. But really, this beautiful space in nature, speaking with all of your wonderful selves, who are just incredible backgrounds and histories, you learn that we need to link the personal with the global. I think more than ever, we need to understand that our own existential and personal struggles are intimately linked with what we see reflected in that world of global politics and in the intellectual abstractions that we grapple with. So I will today tell you the story of my own evolution as a person, as an intellectual, not because my story is any better or worse than anyone else's, but it happened to be that I entered my career as a human rights lawyer at a very particular time in history. And in fact, that coincides with the beginning of my career in 1990, which was right here in Norway. And the first paid job I got, I'm discounting all the unpaid internships, was at the Norske Institut for Menneskerettigheter. All of you Norwegian speakers are laughing right now at my accent. It was a good faith attempt. I remember also at that time research collaboration with the Kristen Mikkelsen Institute, which was much easier to pronounce. And so it's a homecoming for me, in a sense, to be back in Norway, a country with such a rich tradition, not of just great intellectuals, but also of engagement with human rights issues. And of course, 1990 was an incredible time to be graduating. I remember the commencement speaker at Harvard University was Chancellor Helmut Kohl of Germany. And in June of 1990, as I sat there listening attentively to him, he was celebrating the collapse of the Berlin Wall in November 1989, something which would have been unimaginable to those of us who were students in the 1980s. And of course, within a year, Germany was reunified, which in essence ended an unfinished chapter from the Second World War. Communist Europe was liberated. I had a famous Soviet law professor back in the day, Yuri Lurie, who told me, you know what is the difference between capitalism and communism? I said, no, professor, tell me. He says, well, in capitalism, man exploits man, but in communism, it's the other way around. So you saw this whole process of the liberation of communist Europe. And then in 1991, the unthinkable, the dissolution, largely peaceful, of the Soviet Union overnight. So by 1992, Francis Fukuyama is writing about the end of history. I'm sure we're all familiar with that. Now, in retrospect, perhaps delusional euphoria that the world was now on the precipice of once unimaginable possibilities. In 1993, the World Wide Web entered the public domain. A certain Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat concluded the first peace accord in front of the White House. The Maastricht Treaty established the European Union. And what I will speak about in respect of my own engagement with international law was the establishment of the first ever UN tribunal since Nuremberg, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. So this was a time, and then in 1994, Nelson Mandela becomes the president of a multiracial democracy in South Africa. So we can be forgiven for having been so full of hope at that point in time that the world was really reaching, in some respects, the apogee of civilization. Human rights and democratic ideals were spreading throughout the world. So the question is, what happened? Because we went from that to the sense of despair that we have today. And I must confess that I find myself increasingly watching cat videos on Instagram every time I go to the news and I see just one more absurdity, which once upon a time would have been something I would have seen on the Netflix series House of Cards. And when I watch Fox News, I realize that no one in Hollywood could have come up with such an absurd script. So it is a time really to try and reflect about, well, who are we in this great process of transformation, and how should we understand our role in trying to use law as an instrument to affect social transformation. So with your permission, I'm going to just share with you a series of stories, and maybe to try and reflect on what each of those stories could teach us or could give us pause to reflect on. So this photograph is of my, is the photograph up there? Yes, it is. Okay, so that photograph is of my handsome father, glamorous mother, my older brother. I'm the smaller child with the bowl haircut, the low-maintenance bowl haircut, to which I did not consent. And this is an image of a beautiful, innocent childhood in my native Iran, a time of prosperity, community, and togetherness. And when my parents told me that we have to move to this place called Canada, I couldn't understand why we had to leave this really beautiful life to go somewhere where I heard, I don't know, people live in igloos. So coming to Canada as a 9-year-old Middle Eastern child, being one of 2 brown children in the schoolyard, in a world which was not nearly as integrated as it is today, something we should remember when we think about some of the pushback and some of the sort of exclusionary politics today, as how remarkably transformed our own societies have become. To me, human rights, persecution, exile was just an abstraction. It was not yet a felt experience. And my family, we were part of the Baha'i religious minority in Iran, which had faced historical persecution, which was the scapegoat that would invariably be among the first victims of demonization and violence in the event of political turbulence. And of course, by 1979, the so-called Islamic Revolution in Iran created an upheaval, and instead of delivering this promised new just society, as is invariably the case, the reality was one of mass executions and systematic torture. So as a child living abroad, you're trying to process those kind of conversations that your parents have quietly, which still really don't make sense to you. But there was one moment that really, I think, was a turning point for me. And that's when my 16-year-old contemporary, Mona Mahmoudnejad, who was a very remarkable human rights activist already as a high school student, wrote an essay in which she demanded her human rights. And for that, she was imprisoned. And ultimately, in June of 1983, Mona was hanged because of writing an essay. So this is the image of Mona. And I mention this because the first question I asked myself as an immigrant child trying to fit into Canadian culture, interested more in whether I should dress as a rock star or, disco icon. I mean, the kind of things you're worried about in a consumer culture. You realize that back home, someone who's your age has been executed for writing a high school essay. And the first question I ask myself is, why her and not me? And I say this because the beginning of any serious journey towards justice is that question. Why that person and not me? What is the difference between those of us who can sit here in such genteel surroundings having this conversation and those who suffer out there in the world? And it's this basic question of empathy. And I say this because we are intellectuals, we have very brilliant minds, we spend years and years educating ourselves, improving our minds, but ultimately, one of the conclusions I've come to is if we don't have that basic element of empathy, we will never really set out on that journey in search of justice. Or if we only believe that justice is about virtue signaling and cancel culture, we will never have the stamina against the onslaught of all of these dark forces to really stay in that struggle, even if and especially when we are wounded, we're full of despair, and we want to give up. Now, this was the beginning of a process of asking questions. How is it that the judicial system of a country, instead of delivering justice, is being used to justify the hanging of a 16-year-old? Because it was the revolutionary courts in Iran that were handing out all of these death sentences. So this is the beginning of thinking about international justice. Why do we think about international justice? Because national justice has typically failed the victims. So as a student in law school, I began to look into the question of international law, international criminal law in particular, which back then basically meant Nuremberg. It was of historical interest. The idea that there would be an international criminal court was a flight of fantasy. It was just not even conceivable. So I wrote an essay on how the International Court of Justice could be used to enforce the Genocide Convention through basically lawfare and instrumentalizing the authority of international law, at least to give some measure of protection to victims. I speculated on the establishment of International Criminal Court. And while all of my colleagues were, after graduation, in Wall Street getting 7-digit salaries, I was at the Norwegian Institute of Human Rights, getting just enough for my bus fare and a little bit of food here and there. And what is incredible is, once again, getting back to that specific point in history, what happened? Because in 1991, the same year that the Cold War ended, the violent disintegration of the former Yugoslavia also took place. And this became the catalyst for the resumption of the Nuremberg Project. I say this because there are two dimensions here. First of all, the victims were Europeans. The scenes of emaciated bodies behind barbed wires, the instances of the use of rape as a weapon of war, the mass graves, all of these things were not happening somewhere out there in Africa or Asia or what have you, but it was happening half an hour flight away from Vienna. That had a lot to do with the willingness of the international community to at least register these atrocities and to give them some sense of priority. But beyond that, there was this historic window of opportunity where it was possible to get unanimity in the UN Security Council to establish this tribunal. And I say this because much of the historical evolution of international law, in fact, going back to the Nuremberg Charter, to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to the Genocide Convention in 1948, which happened under the shadow of the Holocaust, there is this dialectic, if you like, of unspeakable mass atrocities shocking humankind into taking one step forward. And the horrors of ethnic cleansing in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, served that function, and by 1993, the UN Security Council had established the ICTY, which I will speak about shortly. So I remember as a 20-something-year-old human rights lawyer being sent to the former Yugoslavia, first as a human rights officer before the ICTY was established. And I always like to say I went there trying to save the world and I left just trying to save myself. Because you begin to understand one thing, that there is absolutely nothing glamorous about being a war crimes prosecutor, about witnessing war crimes and understanding just how horrific the reality is for the survivors. So I first flew to Sarajevo on a UN airlift, which we called Maybe Airlines. Maybe you don't get there. And this was the business class lounge at Sarajevo Airport. So you can see me. And I actually borrowed my flak jacket and my helmet because the bureaucrats in Geneva didn't have a budget for flak jackets. And when I said, could you please get me a flak jacket? He says, why do you need one? I said, well, there's a war going on here and there are bullets. So in my first week already, we ended up in this village called Ahmici. That's Colonel Stewart from the Cheshire Regiment, British peacekeeper. And we witnessed in this abstraction, which we called ethnic cleansing, a family with small children who had been shot and burnt to death. And once again, the horrors on the grounds are just really unspeakable. And I say this because Hannah Arendt famously said after the Nuremberg judgment that these crimes explode the limits of the law. On the one hand, the urgency of some form of justice is blindingly obvious. None of us believes that someone who commits genocide should go unpunished. But it's really important also to be humble and to understand that at the end of the day, one leaves with a sense of futility because no amount of justice can undo the lives that have been destroyed. So in the coming months, when the ICTY was established, I was sent to The Hague, in fact, as the first legal advisor. But back then, even though it was remarkable that this tribunal had been established, it was largely seen as a paper tiger. This was not Nuremberg and victor's justice because the perpetrators were still in power. And it was unthinkable back then that those leaders would one day end up in The Hague. I say this because we have to have faith sometimes against impossible odds and to realize that incredible things can happen at the right time. So when I first came to The Hague, we were drafting arrest warrants or indictments against the likes of Ratko Mladic, the famous butcher of Bosnia. But we saw these largely as symbolic. We will issue arrest warrants, we will delegitimize them in the international sphere. Maybe they won't be able to travel anymore. And that was it. That was the extent of our expectation. And then in 1996, a few months after the Srebrenica genocide, in which some 8,000 Bosnian Muslims were executed, the first genocide in Europe since the Second World War, a remarkable thing happened. And I found myself in the very first hearing before the appeals chamber of the tribunal in respect of a man named Dražen Erdemović, who I will speak about shortly. So here is a much younger version of me on ICTY TV, and this is in the appeals chamber of the ICTY. And the real point here is that in this first trial, I had imagined that I would be the prosecutor putting evil on trial. But I actually felt sorry for the defendant. And here is the defendant, Dražen Erdemović, a 20-something-year-old locksmith from Bosnia, who's a Bosnian Croat married to a Bosnian Serb, in a war in which you had to choose sides. And this was another powerful lesson I learned, that yes, there are the evil masterminds of genocide and what have you, but that a lot of the perpetrators are what we call victim perpetrators, in the sense that where do you go if you're from a mixed marriage in an ethnic war, which demonizes the other? And one of the lessons I learned, having been on the ground in Bosnia, is that half of all marriages were mixed. Something that Samuel Huntington, when he wrote Clash of Civilizations, did not understand because he never bothered to talk to anyone on the streets of Sarajevo, to understand just how this was a crossroads of civilization where the Jews fleeing the Spanish Inquisition would come to Sarajevo as a haven where a mosque stood beside a synagogue, beside an Orthodox church, beside a Catholic church. So it was very clear that to rip apart the multi-ethnic fabric of this country, you needed pyromaniacs. You needed the ethnic entrepreneurs who very cynically, as recycled communists, instrumentalized ethnicity, fear, and hatred in order to rise to power. I just never imagined we would see the same thing in the heart of Western liberal democracies. But lessons to be learned. So Dražen Erdemović confessed and even expressed contrition and began to weep in court because he had been forced to execute some 1,500 Muslims. He served prison in Norway, in fact, and then he became a witness for the prosecution, and I saw him once again in the trial of Ratko Mladic, who after many years of hiding with the connivance of Serbian intelligence was finally betrayed and brought to The Hague to stand trial. And in 2017, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. Slobodan Milosevic came to The Hague just before his judgment. He died in prison, sadly. But just to say that we cannot take for granted that the ICTY was established and that for the most part it succeeded. So something that you may find unimaginable today could very well come to pass. Moving on to the next horror story, which really shaped my thinking, this is the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, in which in less than 3 months, up to 1 million members of the Tutsi minority were exterminated, a killing rate twice that of the Nazi death camps, except that it happened right under our nose. And the international community could have stopped it, but there was nothing interesting in Rwanda. There was no oil, no geostrategic interest. And I say this because, going back to what I said about the sense of futility that you have about prosecuting genocide, you realize, as some of you have said in previous sessions, that prevention is the cure. I would be very happy to live in a world in which I am unemployed. And that is the success story, is what does not happen. By the time we have those horrific images of children in the rubble of Gaza, in Darfur, in Tigray, in the many other sites of sorrow around the world, it is already too late. There is very little that one can realistically do. So I think our sense of activism also should be less responsive and less sort of trying to put out this or that fire, but trying to understand some of the roots of the structures and cultural patterns that result in these explosions. So the time to act, in fact, is not when something is on the agenda of the Security Council, but long before. Now, I'm going to tell you a quick story of resilience of my adopted brother, Eloge Boutera, who was my student at McGill University, where I taught for 15 years. Eloge came to my office one day, he sat down and told me the story of how he had survived the genocide in Rwanda to come and become my law student at McGill. And Eloge was with his mother and baby sister. They were Tutsis. They knew that the so-called Interahamwe genocidaire would kill them at one of the roadblocks. So they panically went to the UN compound in Kigali called the École Technique Officielle, where there were 150 Belgian peacekeepers, and they thought that they would be safe there. And of course, they were turned away because there were already several thousand people, and the camp was full. So Eloge said that night we went to the bush with my little baby sister crying. We thought we were going to die, but that in fact is what saved Eloge. Because that night the instructions came for the UN peacekeepers to withdraw, because the international community was more interested in protecting a few Western soldiers than it was in saving the lives of 500,000 Tutsis in some country in Africa. And that evening, almost all of the Tutsi who had sheltered there, about 7,000 or 8,000 of them, were killed one by machete, by the genocidaire. The stories of people running after the UN jeep saying, please don't abandon us. So it's important to understand, once again, empathy, leadership. It boils down to not that there was no solution. There was a simple solution. No one gave a damn about 1 million people in some country in Africa, except when it became a political issue, and then Bill Clinton went to the Holocaust Memorial Museum and everyone began to express contrition. So the lesson from Rwanda, once again, is that genocide is not a tsunami, is not an earthquake. It is a political choice. For the most part, the early warning signs are very clear, and that is the time to act. One of the very simple weapons of mass destruction was something called RTLM, Radio Télévision Libre des Mille Collines, which in a country with 70% illiteracy was used to basically poison poisoned the minds of people, and the casual dehumanization of the Tutsis as cockroaches to be exterminated. One of the lessons one learns also is the power of hate speech, especially in times of turbulence, in times of transition. Does it sound familiar? Yes. The scapegoat, the demonization of this or that group is very reassuring. It's very comforting. So these are other arenas of struggle where we really need to take very seriously our work. Now, all of these precedents, the Yugoslav and Rwanda precedents, allowed finally in 1998 for the establishment of the International Criminal Court, the statute of which was adopted at the Rome Diplomatic Conference. Now, today we're all familiar with the unprecedented assault against the ICC, the sanctioning of the prosecutor and judges in relation to the Gaza conflict, in particular the arrest warrants issued against Prime Minister Netanyahu, the former Defense Minister Gallant. There's nothing new in the clash between global justice and political powers. There's no need to despair. The reason why the Yugoslav and Rwanda tribunals succeeded is because it was politically expedient, fortunately. But when you move from selective justice to global justice, there will invariably be clashes. But in order to feel a bit optimistic, let's go back to the pre-ICC world and realize that throughout the Cold War, there was no justice at all for genocide. There wasn't even talk of individual accountability. The Khmer Rouge, a case in point, 2 million people slaughtered, but because the Khmer Rouge was an effective bulwark against Vietnamese influence in Indochina, the Khmer Rouge was rehabilitated, and the Khmer Rouge ran in UN-sponsored elections in Cambodia in 1993. So that perhaps gives us some point of contrast. One can add to that Mengistu, Idi Amin. There's a long, long list. So the mere fact that there is an ICC that is issuing arrest warrants is a remarkable triumph. And the fact that there is pushback should be celebrated by us all because it means that it is a threat. The worst thing in my line of work is indifference, where a government says we couldn't give a damn about you uncovering the truth or issuing an arrest warrant or having a hearing in The Hague. So this is all part of a difficult historical struggle. The problem of the powerful states with the ICC began in 1998. The United States was one of the countries that voted against the adoption of the Rome Statute because they were against the possibility of US nationals who were on the territory of ICC states parties being subject to arrest warrants. When the prosecutor at the time, Fatou Bensouda, was investigating Afghanistan, which could have implicated US forces, there was the famous Hague Invasion Act that was adopted by the US Congress, and there was talk of ensuring that under no circumstances could a US national be subject to arrest warrants. And the US is not alone. The Russian Federation, like the United States, first signed and then unsigned the ICC statute, and of course the arrest warrants against President Putin has also put the ICC in the crosshairs of the Russian Federation, which has tried to plant spies in the ICC prosecutor's office, in one instance using an intern posing to be Brazilian. I do not hold my Brazilian colleagues responsible for that at all. But you'd be amazed the extent to which these intelligence agencies go. It's all a good sign. They are worried. They realize it's a liability. You may be in power today. You may not be in power tomorrow. The political tides will change, and you could actually end up in The Hague, just like Milosevic was. So China is not party to the ICC statute. India is not a party. Ethiopia is not a party. Ethiopia, let's think about Tigray, where between 200,000 and 600,000 people have been killed in the past years. Who talks about Tigray? So that's another problem of selectivity, not just political selectivity, but also selectivity in the global media. Gaza is absolutely horrifying, so is Darfur, so is Tigray, and that also raises some questions about where we decide to focus our attention, which lives are more important than others. So moving on, there are a few other quick stories I wanted to share with you, reflecting less on the institutional design of the ICC with its problems of jurisdiction. So the ICC exercises jurisdiction in respect of Israeli leaders based on the territory of Palestine. It exercises jurisdiction against the Russian Federation based on the crimes having occurred in the territory of Ukraine. So there are all these gaps in jurisdiction, which I will turn back to shortly. But I want to reflect more now on at the human level about the limits of punitive justice, the sort of good guys and bad guys narrative. How far can it really go? And I learned some of these lessons in the following two quick stories. Here are Badia and Bushra in 2016 in Kabar 2 refugee camp in northern Iraq. They were members of the Yazidi minority. They were 12 and 13 years of age when they were abducted by Daesh, taken to Mosul as sex slaves. And they are absolutely remarkable. And I love to talk about these people because they are just so inspiring. They're such incredible people. And after a few months of abuse, one day they see that the door is open and they just walk out. They just walk out and they just keep on walking out and no one does anything. So they end up in the middle of the Kurdish highlands in the summer when it's about 50 degrees Celsius, and they're about to die of exposure and thirst and exhaustion when an Arab shepherd finds them and adopts them as his own daughters and feeds them and protects them and hides them at a risk to his own life, because if Daesh discovered him, he would be beheaded. So Badia and Bushra were this incredible sort of example of the resilience that we forget about, that people are also capable of. And you begin to understand the difference between calling someone a victim and a survivor. Now, the reason I share this story is because the next day, I went from the refugee camp to meet this young man, Ahmed al-Khatib, age 16, who was a captured Daesh suicide bomber. Now, an unsuccessful suicide bomber, obviously, because I could meet him there, but he was trying to come from Deir ez-Zor in Syria, crossing the border with bombs strapped to himself, and he wanted to kill some of the Kurdish Peshmerga, who he believed were infidels and what have you. And this was one of the most fascinating conversations I had, getting back to the idea of the victim-perpetrator. So he gave us a lecture about his whatever delusional ideology, whatever he'd been brainwashed as a 16-year-old child who has absolutely no idea about anything. And when his lecture was finished, and I knew that this same child with his boyish face, given other circumstances, would have cut my head off, because that is what he was trained to do. And then when they came to take him, our interview was over, I said, do you have any final words to say? He looks back and says, I miss my mother. I wish I could have become a medical doctor. And once again, you begin to understand, even in the perpetrators, these glimpses of humanity, which is very reassuring in the sense that you realize, yes, Ahmed the killer could have been Ahmed the healer, given the right circumstances, which is why I tell a lot of young audiences that I speak with, do not become human rights lawyers. That's not the point of my talk. But take very seriously your opportunity to touch the lives of others, to influence how people think and react. And that sort of empathic populism, which I think is the only antidote to the hateful populism that we see gripping the world. Finally, of course, the children in the camps, another extraordinary instance of resilience, children who are deeply, deeply traumatized, but who can still find time to play. Moving on to a couple of other things before the grand finale. I don't know how much time I have left, about 10 minutes. I'll be very quick. We say in Iran, we say we have 2,500 years of civilization, but we're always half an hour late. So in the name of cultural pluralism, I'm going to be a bit flexible on time. Now, we've talked about punitive justice. This brings me to restorative justice, the importance simply of storytelling in healing and social transformation. And I would say that I have shifted my emphasis more and more towards restorative justice, even though my own discipline is international criminal law. Some time ago, the mothers of Akhavan, who are from my native Iran. Akhavan is a grave site outside of Tehran. It's an unmarked mass grave where thousands of leftist political prisoners, the same ones who cheered the arrival of the Islamic Revolution, were executed in 1988 and dumped unceremoniously. The mothers met at the gravesite trying to find the remains of their children. They became known as the Mothers of Akhavan, or Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo. And they have been iconic in the democratic resistance in Iran. So they came to me and they said, you're the big shot UN prosecutor, professor. We want to prosecute those who killed our children. And I had to give them this long explanation about, well, the ICC has no jurisdiction, the ICJ has no jurisdiction, and I felt utterly useless. At all my years of learning, I cannot give these mothers just a little bit of relief. So we decided to set up a people's tribunal. And the idea was, well, when you go to the ICJ or to the ICC, when you have an arrest warrant, very often it's unexecuted, and it's the power of the legitimacy of international law and the narrative, which is the weapon, if you like, that you're using to pursue justice. And the Iranian people knew nothing about these mass executions because they were committed in the dark of night, and there was an official policy of denial. So we set up the Iran Tribunal. We appointed a panel of highly eminent judges from across the world, and we broadcast the hearings into Iran via satellite television, live streaming, and what have you. We estimate that some 20 million people in Iran heard the stories of the survivors. Many people had written books about it, but those books had gone unnoticed. And this is another thing we as intellectuals need to think about. How do you go outside of your own little bubble to create popular movements, stories, empathy, emotional connection? Mother Esmat, who came there she's from a very small village outside of the city of Shiraz in Iran. She sat down in very simple language. She showed the 4 photographs of her 4 children who had been killed, began to weep. And her words, her story, the pain of a mother, did more to popularize this historical atrocity than all of the works many of us had done in our own little echo chambers. And ultimately, the story of Mother Esmat resulted in a remarkable experience next door in Sweden, where because of the popular understanding of what happened in 1988, we received a telephone call from someone who said, my father-in-law is one of the people that was involved in the mass executions. He played a key role. Of course, these people had pseudonyms. So to make a long story short, we lured this gentleman to Stockholm under the impression that there are 2 beautiful Swedish women waiting to go on a cruise with him in the Baltics, except that he's handcuffed at the gates of his airplane at Arlanda airport, because we had set up with the prosecution service in Sweden the file with some 40 witnesses who testified that this was the man who had basically sent them to the gallows, and it's a long story. So here is Hamid Nouri in front of the photograph of some 8,000 people that were executed that summer. And when he was sentenced to life imprisonment by the Stockholm District Court, this was the scene outside the courtroom. That's Mother Esmat dancing. And these are some of the remarkable transformative experiences that I've had. When people have even some semblance of justice, they are able to reclaim their humanity. Now, sadly, Iran, knowing that hostage diplomacy works with Western liberal democracies, took a few Swedish backpackers and tourists hostage. So Hamid Nouri, a few months ago, was released and sent back to Iran in exchange for the Swedish nationals. But still, the mere fact that he was prosecuted, the mere fact that the Iranian government was complaining about violations of his human rights in the Swedish prisons, please give me a break. It was really a kind of seismic shift in the consciousness of the Iranian people, and it fed into the woman, life, liberty uprising, and just the sense that also this is what a court looks like. So this is what justice looks like. That itself can be an incredible pedagogical moment in a national movement. I will try to finish in 10 minutes, if that's possible, in 5 minutes, very quickly. one example of how we need to be creative in our lawyering goes to the Rohingya genocide and the use of the ICJ where the ICC had no jurisdiction because of the fact that Myanmar, predictably, has not accepted its jurisdiction. So these are some of the villages across the border from Bangladesh looking into Myanmar, where thousands of villages were burnt, and amidst horrific instances of extermination, horrific acts of rape. And I went to Kutub Halong refugee camp, which was transformed from a wild sort of, how do you say, a forest which was a preserve for wild elephants to the biggest refugee camp in the world today in a matter of months. And once again, you see the trauma of the children who have witnessed their parents being killed. Here I spoke with a group of women, one of whom, after speaking about horrific experiences of sexual violence, turned around to me and says, "We want justice from you." Once again, that feeling that you're the outside savior and just don't have the heart to tell them that the cynicism is such that they're not likely to ever receive any justice. So I left this meeting really with my head spinning. And this is the other thing you need to be really careful about in this line of work, the psychic toll of hearing all of these stories. And I saw this beautiful vision which filled me with hope. And it was this Ferris wheel that someone had made out of wood. It was the one place where children could play and laugh, and you heard laughter amidst this heavy silence of extreme trauma in the camp. And it filled me with hope that maybe something can be done, which brings me to the International Court of Justice and its unprecedented record in recent times of human rights litigation. So here is the Peace Palace, constructed in 1913, 1 year before the First World War. And we managed, the story is very long, but in fact, a very distinguished Gambian jurist, Abu Bakr Tambadou, my former colleague at the Rwanda Tribunal, was so moved in the camps that he agreed on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation to bring a case, an actio popularis case, on behalf of the Rohingya victims. And this is a remarkable example of obligations erga omnes, which students of international will know about. Human rights treaties are obligations owed to the entire international community. So we filed the application, requested urgent provisional measures to try and pressure Myanmar from not burning more villages, not killing more people. And we had a historic hearing with the presence of Aung San Suu Kyi, which I will turn to shortly. But I thought that, well, what about the refugees in the camps? The Hague is this little bubble of distinguished professors and practitioners, but what about the survivors? Some of them have to come. So we arranged for these survivors, Yusuf, Hamida, and Hasina, who had never left their village. They'd never been on an airplane, an escalator, an elevator. We got them travel documents to come to The Hague. Someone contributed to put them on an aircraft, Emirates, and the Emirates agent at Dhaka airport, when we told them the story, bumped them up to business class. So they went from the horrors of that refugee camp to 10 hours of binge watching every single Bollywood film there was on the entertainment system. Now they arrive in The Hague, and you saw that image of the Peace Palace, which is so intimidating even for those of us who are cosmopolitan elites. And here they're sitting in the robing room before we go into the hearing with Aung San Suu Kyi, and they are so intimidated, they are so terrified. And it was remarkable to see, here is Aung San Suu Kyi with Abu Bakr Tambadou sitting there. I was not supposed to take that photograph, but very quickly snapped it. And it was remarkable once again to see the sense of betrayal that they had towards this once irreproachable human rights icon. But at the same time, they were shocked that she had to sit there and listen to the testimony of the victims. Just once again, just the image of someone who is not even on a criminal trial, but who has to sit there, who cannot harm them. And after the hearing, you can see them celebrating from the Peace Palace. One of them told me, now we too feel human. We feel that we are human beings. And I told our 3 friends who had gone back to the camps to make sure to send me a photograph once the judgment of the court on that provisional measure was delivered. So a month later, the court delivers 17-0 unanimous opinion by way of an injunction calling on Myanmar to stop committing anything that could plausibly be a genocidal act. And this was the image that our friends sent us. So we have a Gambian representative here who can be very proud. I will stop here, even though I have something else which I want to talk about, small island states and climate change. But I will just end on this thought, that there is plenty to despair about. We should have no illusions. There's a lot of suffering there. In recent times, I've been involved in representing small island states in the Pacific and Caribbean in historic proceedings before the International Court of Justice. You will have probably heard about it in the media. The court recently delivered its unanimous opinion, which I think is really an incredible historical and Nuremberg moment for environmental law. And I mention this because one of the aspects of the court's opinion, which looks at climate change as an existential problem of planetary proportions, is the fact that we can ignore this or that genocide. We cannot ignore the reality of climate change because it's coming after all of us. I say this not to scare you, but this is an incredible opportunity. Because as my indigenous brothers and sisters said in the small island of Tuvalu, population 12,000 in the South Pacific, that is going to go under the water because of rising sea levels, they said in a contest between man and earth, the earth will win. When they talk about natural law, it's not a philosophical construction. It is literally the laws of nature. Our understanding of law is about to be revolutionized. We're going to be looking to our indigenous brothers and sisters to understand that the earth is the source of law and that living in harmony with the natural system, with the climate system, living in community, living lives of empathy, isn't just a nice idea, but it is now a matter of our collective survival. And I would just end by saying that sooner or later, the pendulum will swing, and we should just make sure that we are on the right side of history. There is no time for despair. There is no time for cynicism. I will stop there, and apologies for going over the time. Thank you.
Yeah, welcome all here on stage. I will just briefly introduce all of you to the audience. So to my left here, we have Omar Ba. We already saw you on stage earlier and in the past years, of course, as well. He's the Hardis Family Assistant Professor for Teaching Excellence at the Department of Government at Cornell University. Then next to him, we have Mansour Asal, who is a professor at the Department of Social Anthropology here at UiB. And as a researcher, he's part of the Christian Michelsen Institute. Next, we have Nina Reiners, who is a professor of human rights and social sciences at the law faculty of the university in Oslo. Then next, we already had you on stage as well today, right? So next we have Christine Bertura-Sandvik, who is a research professor in humanitarian studies at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo and a law professor at the university in Oslo. And finally, we have Marte Schleier-Eigendal, and she is a PhD candidate at the law faculty here at the university in Bergen with a focus on military assistance in armed conflict. So thank you all for participating in this panel following this wonderful, really inspiring lecture by Professor Akhavan. My thoughts and I would like to share this before I give all you room to react to the lecture is maybe you can touch on this then later. You touched on this already a bit, the role of prevention, and of course justice is the key in the cases when already harm has been done. But I was wondering, especially while you were talking about all these stories, starting with the little boy with the bowl cut that you were, of the Yazidi girls or this mother from Shiraz weeping over her own children. I was wondering what kind of mechanisms there are and how it is possible that this little boy doesn't even have to leave his home country, and these girls won't even survive this kind of atrocities that they survived, and this mother wouldn't have had to weep over her children. So I was wondering how education, for example, could help in that case, how a society can help to help in that case, and how those ideologies that oftentimes are on the basis of these kind of atrocities, how they can be minimized in that way that these atrocities don't even happen in the first place. So these are just some thoughts I had, but now I would like to open for all our wonderful panelists. You all have 3 to 5 minutes each to react to the lecture, and then Professor Akhavan, you will have the opportunity to react all of our panelists, and followed by all the questions from the audience. And I hope we have lots of time so we can all listen to your questions, and Professor Akhavan can also react to them properly.
Thank you, Dorothy. And thank you also to Professor Akhavan for this very moving lecture. In the short minutes that I have, I will probably just touch upon a couple of things from the lecture. One is this euphoric moment of human rights, the late 80s, early 90s. The question of community and the question of humanity. As you have also said in the lecture, we are meeting here in a context of tragic times. One could obviously say that every time has been, to some extent, a tragic time. But there has been almost 2 years of a live-streamed genocide, and also other man-made, for the most part, catastrophes beyond Gaza. But again, if we do go back a couple decades ago, where there were a sense of human rights triumphalism. Louis Henkin, who was a longtime professor at Columbia Law School and credited with the initiation of the academic study of human rights, had said in the late 90s that ours is the age of rights, and that human rights have become the only political moral idea of our time that has received a universal acceptance. Then the question right now in these tragic times is that so? Has human rights achieved universal acceptance? Do we actually live in an age of human rights now? It seems that there is a cold shower that has rained on this euphoric moment of human rights triumphalism that we witnessed the past couple decades. And it is difficult right now to assert that justice is cascading. Many of you in this room are familiar with that literature. So in this brief reflection on these tragic times, and because I'm trained in the field of international relations, not international law. So my reflection will touch a bit of a history from the perspectives of 2 judges from the Third World. Both of them wrote at a time of tragedies themselves, one right after World War II and the other one in the late 70s. The first judge that I will reference here is Judge Radha Binod Pal from India, who was an accidental judge at the Tokyo Tribunal after World War II. He is quite a controversial figure in many ways. He's the only judge who had said that the Japanese officials who were being put in trial should be found not guilty of the crimes that they were accused. He wrote a 1,000+ page dissenting opinion. He was not a man of a few words. But again, I think there is a lot we can learn from Judge Pal, and that is relevant to our current moment in international law, international human rights, and world politics. I'll focus only on one thing about Judge Paul's scholarship here, and that is that of the idea of an international community. So in 1948, Paul said there is no such a thing as an international community. And this is a time when the Allies were putting on trial those that they had defeated during World War II in the name of the international community. Paul said that there is no such an international community because, quote, a substantial part of humanity is still confronted with the actual plague of imperialism. Humanity was not, he argued, universal. It still is not. We are not equally human on this blue planet. So for Paul, several states just coming together and obligating themselves with a set of rules doesn't make a community under a reign of law. There are still dominated and enslaved nations, Paul said during a lecture at the University of Calcutta in 1955. Then the tragedy here, Paul said, is that even in the wake of the two world wars, there hasn't been an awakening within any of us with a sense of unity of mankind. There's no feeling that we are a unity of humanity linked to all our fellow human beings. And to conclude with Paul's argument here, the international community yet to be built would have to include a shared norm which understands imperialism as a crime. The second figure I will evoke here in 30 seconds. Is it okay? Okay, thank you.
Maybe in the conversation after the event then, yes? Wonderful. But thank you so much already for this answer. It is, right? Please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor, for this very moving and touching keynote. And I don't think the challenges facing international humanitarian law needs to be stressed. I'm not a lawyer. I'm a social anthropologist. And in anthropology, we love to complicate things that are already complex. So to do this, I will just reflect on the situation in Sudan. And I think all of you know that the former President Bashir was indicted by the ICC in 2009. 16 years later, he is still at large, even after he left power. The others that were indicted with him, the defense minister and the state minister for interior were still at large. As a matter of fact, they are being protected by the government. Now, the indictment came at the background of serious human rights violations, including war crimes. And ironically, Bashir himself formed a national committee to investigate what was going on in Darfur. And the conclusion of the committee was that war crimes were committed. And nothing happened. In Sudan, people were debating at the time whether this indictment is going to serve the victims and their loved ones or not, or whether it will complicate the situation instead. People were also debating what should be served first, peace or justice. And that debate is actually still on the table. Now, one of the points that a lot of Sudanese were stressing was that the former atrocities were not addressed, justice was not served, and other atrocities are being committed. You know, we have the war that has started in April 2023. We saw all the violations from all sides, including the national army. And people are wondering what's going on, what should happen so that the justice could be served for the victims and their loved ones. I don't have an answer. But as a Sudanese, I am one of those who think that the indictment of President Bashir has done two things. It failed to serve justice, and it further complicated the situation in the country. Thank you very much.
Okay, that gives me your 2 minutes left. Yeah, thank you very much. I am very happy to join this roundtable. I was preparing for the topic of the lecture, which is the future of international human rights law. And we had a welcome event last week in Oslo for our new master students at the faculty under the topic of Is International Law Dead? And I moderated the session and started it with a joke. Namely, does anyone know in this room a joke about international law? No. Well, it doesn't matter. So I think we can easily adapt that to human rights. But I think today's lecture by Payam shows us indeed why it does matter. And I really want to thank you for not only showing and talking about it, but also living it. And I think that's my main points also today, the point of optimism when we look into the future of international human rights. But also I share maybe how Umar started his points about that there is an unprecedented time, I guess, of also being very pessimistic about it. So Payam watches cat videos on Instagram. I watch documentaries like his, In Search of a Better World, by human rights defenders. And I was also very happy to hear that you started your career at the institute that I'm at now. So yeah, so a lot of reasons for optimism here just this afternoon. And I think also from my own scholarship and what we heard today, I see still so much possible when committed individuals work together to defend human rights, develop international law. As we heard, it's not really necessarily those innovations that come from states, but really rather committed individuals on the ground. But what I also see now is that a lot of the successful networks and coalitions at the international level, transnational level, have provided a kind of playbook for advocates and governments from the far right, ultra-conservative end of the political spectrum, and they are more and more occupying the space in international human rights institutions that have previously been a very safe space for those to meet and defend human rights. So my background is less international criminal law, but really the human rights institutions based in Geneva-based human rights institutions, so to say the daily bread and butter of international human rights law. And we can see here that the human rights experts have also increasingly become nominated and appointed in a strategic way. So not necessarily those who are the most progressive human rights experts, but those who might provide a counter movement to the progressive international liberalism that so many actors now turn to as a source of evil and on the international level. So this is the concerns for my pessimism now for the future of international human rights law is really, I think the times have never been harder. So in addition to what I just said, I think we all know about the funding crisis of international organizations, that of course they have never been very well equipped, but it's never been so desperate. We have a shrinking civic space that is increasing around the world. We heard it today also, what is happening in countries when you try to do human rights advocacy without actually calling it human rights, or when your NGO cannot really work on some topics. We also see increasingly repression against human rights defenders, not just in domestic context, but also on the UN grounds. And we see, and that's where I want to end my intervention today, that so-called liberal actors are coming into these institutions on the very same paths. And we know, of course, all those important states, Russia, China, that try to redefine, reinterpret what human rights are. But I also want to add to our conversation here these capitalist actors, so those that are for profit and cooperating more and more with global governance institutions, with UN, thanks to the SDG 17, for example. Also, this is now a legitimate partnership at the individual level. I have a new project where I study very big corporate law firms that do pro bono, that have supported the special rapporteur on the right to a healthy environment, for example, with research, with advice, with collaborating on a draft resolution. And linking back to courts, for example, that have at the domestic level also advised governments on establishing environmental courts, even though they are not neither experts on environmental law nor necessarily on the local and domestic law. So I would conclude by saying that this is my main concern for pessimism here, that we see less and less active civil society in international human rights law institutions, and not only a lot of illiberal actors on the ideological spectrum, but also more and more for-profit actors that have a different motivation for human rights.
Very good. I think one of the things I've been thinking about a lot recently is what it's like for people who are not living in the 90s and sort of what their trajectory is. So thank you so much for sort of your background story. So I think I have 2 points. The one is that I think we simply can't help ourselves. And the second is that everything we built isn't necessary to preserve. So let me just go through this. So in the spring of 1996, I'm 20 years old. I'm living with a Ugandan family on the Congolese and Rwandan border, and you know, being out in the bush late at night, not understanding much, to be honest, before afterwards, which was fine. But that summer, I'm volunteering at a camp in Norway where we have Norwegian activists meeting Bosnian kids coming out of the camps. And there's a Bosnian 13-year-old with gray hair. And for me, that was sort of life-changing experience. I mean, I never left, right? But I also see that throughout my life. I mean, I've seen an amazing amount of people who never left. I mean, you guys never left. My Ugandan colleagues here never left. There are Sami lawyers coming out of our faculty who make a law association. There are Kankwamo lawyers in Colombia who organize for the survival of their people. I mean, people just, you know, keep fighting. I don't think we can, as a species, we can't help ourselves. And you know, sometimes that's the ultimate cost. But I also think maybe it's easier for 20-year-olds to see this today, growing up with Gaza demonstrations, than it is for someone who's 30. Because human rights have been sort of in a crisis. I mean, it's a long time ago since it was powerful. But you know, if you're 20 today, I mean, you see the acute resistance, and maybe that's easier to sort of be inspired by. I don't know. The other point is that I'm a humanitarian studies professor. And we've been complaining and moaning that we're unfit for purpose for like decades. And now really the world thinks so too, so we're losing all the funding and everything is folding. And you know, that might actually not be such a disaster. So you know, you're producing funding gaps, right? It doesn't necessarily correspond to the need on the ground. So, but except for Gaza and Ukraine, every single crisis in the world is now radically underfunded, with Sudan being the worst example. And I have to say that, you know, this sector needs to shrink ideologically, operationally, institutionally. I mean, it's a sort of fairly long nightmare of elite exploitation. But you know what's really funny? Except for IHL, this is a community who really dislikes the law. They dislike lawyers, they dislike litigation, they dislike legal counsel, they dislike spending money on lawyers, they dislike being regulated. So it's been kind of fairly fascinating to see them starting to turn again, you know, towards, for example, strategic litigation, starting to turn towards the use of courts as something that they can do with the humanitarian system. But I think they really, most humanitarian organizations are, you know, billion-dollar enterprises with no lawyers. I mean, you could never run a private sector enterprise like this, right? So there's sort of this willful blind spot in terms of law, which is fascinating to observe. And obviously what concerns a lot of organizations today is the existence of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. It's a relief operator, has nothing to do with humanitarianism. If the humanitarians were better, you know, they didn't have to do sort of outrage petitions. They could start doing technical strategic lawfare and you know, get rid of this foundation. Actually, they would have done it before, like 6 months ago. But there's a lot of work to do. You know, there's a lot of sort of quite technical organizing that this community can learn from the human rights community that I think would be transferable, and it would be interesting to see how things unfold. But as a sector, you know, the money should go to community-based organizations, human rights organizations, and justice initiatives. So I think when we think that the world order has fallen apart, not everything is said.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for a very moving keynote. Yeah, I was touched, almost made me cry as well. And I prepared a comment that maybe fits into how the ICJ could be used as sort of an instrument to further develop international law. And I think, so Dorothy mentioned that my PhD project is on military assistance and specifically on third state obligations under humanitarian law. And a lot is happening right now in the ICJ on developing this norm of ensuring respect for international humanitarian law in all circumstances. So I was thinking to just tell you a little bit and how the court is now looking at that, and maybe as sort of a hopeful comment, even though it's developing in a very terrible time, of course. So in the Geneva Convention's Article 1, there is a statement saying that all states are under an obligation to ensure respect for international humanitarian law in all circumstances. And this obligation is very contested interpretation. So some schools would say that this is purely an obligation on each individual state to make sure that its own state, or that it's that state and its inhabitants act in accordance with humanitarian law when conducting or taking part in armed conflict. So the other school would say it doesn't stop there. This is also an obligation to ensure respect by other parties. So even if, for example, Norway is not the party to an ongoing conflict, it still is under an obligation to ensure that the parties to a specific armed conflict acts in accordance with the applicable humanitarian law. So, as I said, this has been very contexted, and the ICJ has issued statements on this only 2 times before 2024. And it's been, well, some would say that the statements would, you could take them in to support the sort of the third state obligation, but others have argued not. But now recently, in the context of the ongoing war in Gaza, the ICJ has issued 2 statements that I think is in support of this third state obligation. And yeah, and I think this is actually very powerful. Of course, it's always an implementation problem, but I would just briefly mention the one case. It's Nicaragua against Germany. And Nicaragua asked for a preliminary measures against Germany to stop arms export to Israel. So the court said that they're not going to issue that order. However, they didn't reject that Germany actually have an obligation to ensure that Israel is following its obligations under the Geneva Conventions number 4. So, and I would like to just read what the court said, because I think it's quite powerful. And it's important to note that, of course, this statement, it's made in the case and the context of German arms exports to Israel, but of course it applies in any case of arms transfer. So it said that, referring to what it had already said on Common Article 1, the court consider it's particularly important to remind all states of their international obligations relating to the transfer of arms to parties to an armed conflict in order to avoid the risk that such arms might be used to violate the above-mentioned conventions, which is the Geneva Conventions and the Genocide Convention. All these obligations are incumbent upon Germany as a state party to these conventions in its supply of arms to Israel. And I would also just mention that in the advisory opinion, also for 2024, on the illegal occupation of Israel, of the occupied Palestinian territories, the court also said that all states parties to the Fourth Geneva Conventions have the obligation to ensure compliance by Israel with international humanitarian law as embodied in this convention. So in my reading, these statements is in clear support of this third state obligation aspect of Common Article 1. And I think even, of course, the court doesn't really elaborate on the specific content of what it entails. I think this is something that will need to be elaborated more upon in the following judgment in the Germany-Nicaragua case, and also in different pending cases in national courts going on right now, looking at the ICJ statement, so, and also in state practice. So just to say that yeah, these terrible times also bring cases to the ICJ that might actually have a sort of a positive, if you could say that, aspect into the interpretation of international law. So yeah, that was my comment.
Thank you all so much for your very broad and variety of comments and interventions. I would like to give Professor Akhavan now about 10 minutes to react to all those comments. And while he does so, please, all you know it by now, line up at the microphone. And then we try to take as many questions as possible and still have the time then also get the answers then for all those. So please, Professor Akhavan.
Thank you. I will try not to take up the entire 10 minutes so that I can learn from all of the participants. And first of all, I'm really grateful to this long succession of distinguished speakers, and there's a lot to digest. But there are 2 points that really struck me. The first is the theme of tragic times, difficult times, and I will accept that. Certainly, we live in times which pose very serious challenges, and in particular, we can no longer take for granted our narrative of linear progression of human rights ideals and what have you. But I will tell you the story of my 97-year-old father, who was born in 1928 in Iran, where life expectancy was under 30 years of age. He lost half of his brothers and sisters to dysentery and cholera, and a mother would typically, as was the case in pre-modern societies throughout the world, a mother would bury half of her children, and she wouldn't have time to be triggered and go to a therapist. She would have to go back home without electricity, without running water, and feed her other children who would otherwise starve. So I mention this because I'm so inspired by his resilience, and in general by the resilience of that generation. And then I teach at the elite universities, and all the students have anxiety, depression, stress. So it makes me think, how did we end up here? Because I'm sorry, but whatever we're going through today is nothing compared to what our ancestors, in my case, my father's, not that far back in history, went. So I would just want to begin by saying that the mere fact that we have a life expectancy of 80-something years is unbelievable, unimaginable to previous generations. The spread of literacy, of access to information, and I could just go on and on to talk about all the things that we take entirely for granted. The idea of my father speaks to his grandchildren on Zoom. It's insane that we have something called Zoom. Even in my generation, It was only in a James Bond film that you would see whatever M giving James Bond instructions in his Aston Martin, right? So we live in a time of unprecedented, unimaginable possibilities and prosperity. And I say this because that is why we worry about human rights. If you have a life expectancy of 30 years, someone says, I want freedom of expression, it will just look at you with a blank stare. What are you talking about? I want to make it through the day without starving to death, without being raped, without being murdered, without whatever the case may be. So I ask my students sometimes in the laws of war, what was the Red Cross movement invented at the Battle of Solferino by Henri Dunant and not in medieval Europe? Because medieval Europe was so horrifying that no one worried about a wounded soldier dying a painful death on the battlefield, which was what moved Henri Dunant to get women from a neighboring village and set up a field hospital, the beginning of the Red Cross movement. So without diminishing the serious challenges that are before us, let us celebrate the incredible period of history that we live in, the lives and possibilities that we have, and let us not despair. And this brings me to the second point. Why is there so much despair? I was talking to one of my dear friends about this idea of Ubuntu, you know, in Africa, and the sort of communitarian sense that people have. We today live in a hyper-consumerist, materialistic culture, which celebrates narcissism, celebrates greed, and masks it with some whatever politically correct speech, woke ideology. But at the core, we are fragmented. We're losing our sense of community, our sense of self, our sense of empathy, of authentic, genuine connections with others. In the Facebook generation, look at the spike in self-harm and suicide among children of the social media generation. The statistics are there. Now, I'm not a therapist, but I can draw the connections between that and what Carl Jung called the collective psychosis, which explains Trumpocalypse and all of these other extremist ideologies. We're living in an era of extraordinary turbulence and transition, not just in terms of technology, economic, and social structures, but even in terms of our identities, our sense of self. When I ended up on this theme of the indigenous, the Pacific Islanders, who tell me about living in harmony with nature, living in harmony with community, I think that we need to go back to basics. If we want to understand why the liberal elites are losing to the right-wing demagogues and hateful populism, we need to understand what is it about the way in which we deliver our message which is making us lose that battle. Which is why I began with empathy, with emotional intelligence, connection, storytelling, which are now groundbreaking theories. I was fascinated. I went to a seminar at Harvard. Someone was talking about groundbreaking theory of narrativization. I said, is that like storytelling? Because my grandmother used to sit me on her laps and tell me stories. That's how children learn. So that just tells you how far we have strayed in our little bubble from some elemental truths about how you mobilize people. You have to touch people. Final point, which begins with what you said, do all of these people need to suffer in order to wake up and do something? No. But this is the problem, that most human beings don't care until they suffer, until they feel pain. And the question is, well, how do we motivate people to care in this culture of selfishness, narcissism, materialism? How do you get people to care? The famous saying, all that it takes for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. In Yugoslavia, in Rwanda, in the United States today, across the world, all it takes is very small, horrible, psychotic, corrupt elites to drive an entire nation down the road to hell. It's always very small elites with passive majorities that don't care, that are staring into TikTok. They're busying themselves with whatever Hollywood gossip and you know, the sports contest or whatever the case may be. So in building culture, I think we are engaging in the most profound form of resistance. I deal with heads of state and government all the time, and I have very little faith that they will do what is necessary to take us where we need to go. Where I have faith is in the seismic shifts in consciousness, in building a sense of community, of caring, of compassion. Even in our own small lives, we are engaging in political transactions, in social struggles. So I'm optimistic because I do think, as I said, that the pendulum will swing, but we are witnessing today the symptoms of a disease which has been a long time in the making, and that is this corrosive consumerism, greed, narcissism, corruption. And in a sense, I think it's good that we have Trump and Epstein and all of this filth, which has always been there, but now let it stare people in the face so that they wake up, they come out in the streets, they start having conversations, they start asking, how am I going to live my life? How did we get here? So my hope is that the newer generations will perhaps have a different sense of our place in the world.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor. I think we can all draw so much from everything we just heard, and lots of optimism, but also, of course, cautiousness. And now we're very excited to hear all the questions from the audience.
I'm sorry about your anger, but the point is that I've also learned that anger will only get you so far. The Buddhists have a saying, anger is like drinking poison to kill your enemy. So the anger is there. I'm also angry about what has happened to my family, what is happening today to my friends who are raped and tortured and executed in Iran, what is happening to the children under the rubble in Gaza, what is happening in Tigray, where 10 times more people than Gaza have been killed. No one gives a damn. Have you read anything on CNN, BBC, anything about Tigray, about Darfur? So I could go on and on and on, but where is it going to get us, right? So one thing I've also learned is you have to transform your anger into a constructive, positive force, and you have to plan your life individually, in community with others, to get something done. And by the time you get to the mass murder, and I specifically refer to the arrest warrants against Benjamin Netanyahu, you may have missed that. The point is, what is that going to do to those traumatized children whose life has been destroyed and shattered, who are never going to heal? I also understand that because I've been in enough refugee camps. So anyways, what I'm saying is, my point is not that, oh, life is really good. No, but we live in an age where we can care about Gaza, where there are protests about Gaza, because people see what is happening there, which we would not have seen a generation ago without social media, without satellite television, and whatever. I remember the age when you would not get news about what's happening halfway across the world until 2 weeks later. And people actually care. There are enough people who've made this an issue, which is more than I can say once again for Tigray, Darfur, and the many other places in the world. So the anger is good, have that passion, but one has to step back, whether you like it or not, and dig in for the long run, because the anger is just going to consume you. Before this turns into a therapy session, I'm going to stop.
Okay, I will make sure that I don't go over this time. Part of the point I was trying to make earlier, going back to the immediate after World War II period, was this argument that there is still a missing piece in a common understanding of humanity as being universal. There is still this lack of viewing all parts of humanity as being part of the same family. And when I said that we are not equally human on this planet, I mean that by looking at Gaza, but also looking at how many dark-skinned migrants are dying and in drowning at the gates of the very liberal, very humanitarian Europe. Where is that conversation here? So again, we are not equally human in this planet, and an international community is yet to be built.
Well, I closed my previous intervention with a rather pessimist tone, and I would like to correct that by agreeing with the professor that there is hope, and that the very fact that these dictators are indicted and they are forced to feel that they are run after in itself is some sort of justice for the victims. However long it might take, at the end of the day, I am one of those who believes that justice would be served.
Yeah, then I would use my 1 minute to come back also to the point that the questions about, so where would we see maybe positive change happening? Where would we see holding up human rights when all we hear right now are stories of despair? And I think, yeah, that's why also it's important to have in this moment lectures that remind us of what is possible, of course, when committed individuals fight for human rights and group together. But the cause of pessimism then, on the other hand, is that this is just made very, like it's so difficult from my point of view. When I look at the international institutions, when I look at what is happening, we see too many barriers for individuals to do exactly that. And yeah, I don't know if that's worthy of.
So thank you for excellent thought-provoking questions. I would say I'm uncomfortable ranking civilian loss. I think activism on Gaza will unfortunately also be critically appraised decades from now, particularly in how it insisted that it was singular. But I do think also there are new opportunities. In the 24 hours after the ethics fund scandal or ethics council scandal breaking, the lawyers thought there wasn't enough law. The sort of finance people thought they weren't speaking about reputation enough. The ethicists thought that the problem was that ethics had been washed. You know, but we could, historians for Palestine had done this report in June, right? So there's a lot of new things to work with, you know, structures that we could attach and attack. But you said that there are corporate structures now. We need to stop pinching our nose and engage. You know, they're there. You know, the big tech is there. It's not going to go away. So like getting better tools. And also, you know, the international community isn't someone else, it's us. You know, the time from you're 25 until you're 33 and its responsibility is yours is like, whoop. And then you become 50 and everything. But you know, like it's us, right? And we have to be as creative as we can.
I think I'll just give you my minute. Yes, I'm like, my head is full, so please.
My head is even more full, but not of particular useful things. I'm going to just focus on three issues. First of all, my distinguished colleague, Professor Varun. Genocide, the basic definition is the intention to physically or biologically destroy a group in whole or in substantial part. And in substantial part, it's not clear what that means. If there's a Yanomami tribe in the Amazon of 1,000 people, you kill 500 people, that's 50% of the population. What if it's China with 1.2 billion people? So when you actually look at Raphael Lemkin as a jurist who was a survivor of the Holocaust, trying to transform his mourning into a legal concept, you actually realize genocide is a very problematic legal concept, very useful from a socio kind of historical perspective, because criminal law is about precision, and genocide is very unwieldy because a situation could or could not be genocide. Reasonable people, experienced jurists could profoundly disagree, which is why I think it's misguided to say, is it genocide and therefore important, or is it something else which we can ignore? That is profoundly misguided. And I don't like this debate about Gaza is terrible because it's genocide. Isn't it bad enough? Why do you need a specific legal label? Why? Because it has a certain potency, it has the legacy of the Holocaust. And war crimes and crimes against humanity are good enough for me. We don't need to be splitting hairs. Now, in terms of South Africa's case, the problem with ICJ jurisdiction is that it's piecemeal. There is the only basis for jurisdiction is Article 9 of the Genocide Convention, so it's boom or bust. Either South Africa wins on the genocide point or it goes empty-handed, even if there are war crimes and crimes against humanity. That's because we don't have a UN Human Rights Court. That's because in 1946 in the Cold War, no one wanted a UN Human Rights Court. It was proposed by Australia, Belgium proposed in 1947 there should be a special chamber of the ICJ. Those who believed in world peace through world law would say the ICJ should have universal compulsory jurisdiction. It doesn't. And international law works best where it matters least. It works best in highly developed democratic societies that worry about the rule of law and the implications of legitimacy. It works least in highly violent states where international law can be dismissed one way or the other, and that's the problem. It's the gentle civilizer of nations. Second point, global south versus global north. I think we need to have a more nuanced approach. This isn't the world of the 1980s anymore, right? China is about to surpass the United States in economic power. If you're a Uyghur from Xinjiang, you're probably going to look at the whole global north, global south thing differently. And you're going to say, thank God for the global north that raises this issue because no one in the global south gives a damn. Where are the fellow Muslim countries when it comes to the treatment of the Uyghur in China? They're absolutely silent in a case which others have suggested is another silent genocide. So I think we also need to think about the decline of US leadership. The ICTY happened because of US leadership. Whatever other things the US did wrong, it did something right, and that set the stage, in fact, for the ICC, which the US then pushed back because it didn't want a court that it could not control. This is the reality of politics. It's complex. I don't care about global north, global south. Wherever there is an opening, exploit it. And understand politics is a messy, horrible world. It's easy to be in the echo chamber shouting slogans, much more difficult to understand. How do you talk to this or that prime minister to convince them to do something that is in their political interest, which also helps advance the cause of human rights? You can do the same thing in the corporate world. You can do the same thing in many different contexts. We need to become much more strategic, much more savvy, because the anger, as my brother said, I am fucking angry. And I could tell you stories about what I have gone through, never mind the anger of my own people, the anger of Rwanda, the anger of Bosnia, the anger of people who have nothing to do with my people, but who are fellow human beings. But we need to think strategically. We need to be smart. And when it comes to something like Gaza, Tigray, whatever, these things have been a long time in the making. Are there signs of hope? Yes, there are. There's public outcry. Even, never mind that, even in Israel, thousands of people are protesting now against Netanyahu, saying, put an end to the war. They may have different motivations, but I see that as a bigger sign of hope than anything else, that within these societies, people will wake up and say, that is enough. We're sick and tired of seeing people, children being pulled out of the rubble with missing limbs. And the good side of this is that we live in a society where people have that sensitivity. In previous generations, it would not be seen, out of sight, out of mind. Final point, the famous saying, and this goes back to my distinguished colleague from India who talked about many interesting things which I cannot possibly touch on. There is a famous saying, the Holocaust did not begin in the gas chambers, it began with words, right? And from the dehumanization of Palestinians to the dehumanization of Bosnian Muslims, Rohingya, in every case that I've been in, incitement to hatred has been absolutely instrumental for mobilizing people. And in every instance, the victimizers saw themselves as the victims. In every case, I'm killing you because I'm the victim. So we need to understand much more the psychology of hatred, the hateful populism which feeds on those basic impulses of fear and hatred. We need to learn empathic populism. How do we push the right buttons, which can be just as strong of courage, solidarity, compassion. That, in the end, is how you prevent this slide into autocracy, let alone genocidal violence. Not interesting intellectual arguments. But we have to stop looking at emotions as something that doesn't matter. No, we need to become much more sophisticated and intelligent about whether it's narrativization, whether it is appropriating certain cultural symbols in different contexts. How do you create mass movements? You touch people, and you either touch people in a negative way and drive them to genocidal violence, or you can lift their spirits. The story of the Arab shepherd who sheltered the Yazidi women. I could give many, many such stories in many, many other contexts. In the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, who's talking about Bet Salem and Al-Haq, two human rights organizations on the Israeli-Palestinian divide that are sister organizations that have been for decades? Who's talking about the Palestinian and Israeli Mothers for Peace? The media isn't interested. War sells. But these are the movements that ultimately are going to bring us out of this hell. And this is what I'm saying. Let's say there's a ceasefire. How long before the next war begins? We have to find a solution, a path to peace. That is the problem. And who's going to sit at the negotiating table? Netanyahu, Hamas? So this is a failure, profound failure of leadership. And we need to really understand that whether we like it or not, these are part of larger historical struggles. My final point is, of course we don't believe in universal human rights when it comes to practice. But look at the horrific violence of history. This is what people forget. This is what I was talking about my 97-year-old father. The hundreds of millions of people that were killed right here on this continent. Never mind the Nazi horrors. What about the saturation bombing of Dresden and Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Deliberate mass murder of civilians by the democratic champions of the world. We forget about it. The ethnic cleansing of Germans from Eastern Europe. So our history is so catastrophically violent that it's important just to put in perspective, not to diminish what is happening today. It's unacceptable, but we also need to be realistic and understand that it's not a question of waving a magic wand and achieving, kumbaya utopia, or drowning into despair and anger and self-destruction. This is not the way we can bring change. One last point, which I think is important. No, it's very important. On a positive note, on a good note, one of the reason I wanted to bring up the story of Dragan Erdemovic is I have seen so many killers who have suffered profound trauma. And this is very important to understand. People are not, the average war criminal I've met is not a psychotic killer. They become that way. They are brainwashed, they're conditioned. And the promise there is that you can understand that there is something visceral within most human beings that doesn't compel them to kill a fellow human being with whom, at some basic level, they feel a common connection. The Einsatzgruppen in Nazi Germany had a real problem with psychological breakdown. And that's one of the reasons the Nazis moved to gas chambers, because of the trauma of people executing women and children and having to carry the bodies. And I could give you many stories, many stories. So the point is to understand that it is not in our nature to hate and to kill, but that we need to figure out how we bring out the higher self, if you like, at a civilizational level. That's the challenge before us.
Thank you very much for these powerful closing remarks. And thank you once again for your very much inspiring and, as we all see, thought-provoking lecture and all your wonderful remarks and the contributions from the whole audience. Thank you so much.